Andre Ward was one of the craftiest technicians in modern times. An extremely clever and well-rounded fighter, Ward was able to work out everyone he stepped into the ring with. And during his time at the top of the super middleweight and light heavyweight divisions, he defeated an array of Hall of Famers and top world champions and challengers. His run in the super middleweight Super 6 tournament was where he made his name, where during that time period from the first round to the final, he defeated top fighters in Mikhail Kessler, Arthur Abraham, Carl Froch, Saki Obika and Alan Green, cementing himself as the world's best super middleweight. There was then a stoppage victory over the highly rated light heavyweight champion Chad Dawson, but it was after he would move up to light heavyweight and score his two defining victories against the pound-for-pound star and knockout machine light heavyweight champion Sergey Kovalev that really cemented Ward's legacy. Kovalev was a genuine top-level fighter, and whilst their first fight was close, Ward displayed his grit, determination and adaptability and ended the rematch with a stoppage. Ward was the epitome of doing anything to win, and whilst a master technician and an elite tactician, he showed against some of the strongest fighters in the world that his strength and inside fighting was extremely underrated. Ward won every fight he ever had, yet a seemingly early retirement and inactivity throughout periods of his prime slightly hold his ranking a little bit lower than the other great Americans. Jeeves Former is one of the roughest and toughest middleweights in boxing history. Fighting with an extremely awkward style and a cross guard, Former was always a handful and was able to rough up some of the greatest fighters in history. The middleweight champion of the world famously beat the great Sugar Ray Robinson twice, giving the legendary Robinson two brutal fights. Former would also score two knockout victories over the legendary welterweight and middleweight champion and fellow tough man Spinx Basilio. There were also 3 additional victories against Wilf Greaves, whilst beating Benny Perret, the welterweight champion, and Rocky Castellani. Former was historically a 2-time middleweight champion of the world, making 7 successful defences against many of the greatest the division's ever seen. Not necessarily deemed as one of history's hardest ever punchers, but without a doubt, one of the most relentless. At the absolute peak of his powers, Shane Mosley was deemed as the best pound-for-pound fighter on the planet. And according to the illustrious Ring magazine, Mosley would hold that top spot for multiple years in the early 2000s, where he had blitzed the lightweight division with a furious combination of both power and speed, and had then jumped up 2 weight divisions to defeat Oscar De La Hoya, amassing a record of 38-0. And whilst this peak lasted over an impressive 5-year streak, Mosley would continue to fight the best fighters in the world for well over the next decade. He would famously defeat De La Hoya in the rematch, winning titles at light middleweight, would score 2 knockout victories over Fernando Vargas, and a brutal knockout victory against the highly rated, dangerous Antonio Margarito. There was his extremely competitive fight against the primed and undefeated Miguel Cotto, as well as multiple fights against Vernon Forrest and Winky Wright. Whilst Mosley was consistently fighting the best of the early 21st century, he would go on to face the 3 main fighters that would define the next eras of the sport, in Manny Pacquiao, Canelo Alvarez and Floyd Mayweather Jr., pulling off the rare occurrence of catching Mayweather multiple times with clean shots. Mosley saw it all in the ring, dominating in his peak years, fighting the greatest fighters of all time, and even past his best, pulling off excellent victories. There's no doubting that Mike Tyson is one of the most iconic and impactful boxers in history. During his 3-year stint, in which he became the undisputed heavyweight champion, Tyson was the biggest star in sports, and an electrifying knockout machine with the pure aim of destruction. And during this time, he may well have been the most talented heavyweight since the emergence of the great Muhammad Ali. His first round knockout over Michael Spinx, a great light heavyweight and heavyweight champion in the first round, was Mike at the absolute pinnacle of his powers. Throughout his career, he would defeat the likes of Larry Holmes, albeit slightly past his best, Donovan Ruddock, Frank Bruno, Andrew Galotta, Trevor Berbick and many others. As 1990 emerged, Tyson looked to be cementing himself as one of the greatest of all time. But following a devastating upset defeat to Buster Douglas, Tyson's path became derailed with all of the turmoil outside of his life. 4 years of inactivity and eventually losing to the likes of Holyfield and Lewis slightly hold Tyson's rankings in this list back. Yet it's worth noting he did win 2 more heavyweight titles against Frank Bruno and Bruce Seldon, but no boxer in history has ever emulated the excitement Tyson did in those first 10 world title wins. Jake LaMotta has a claim to being the toughest boxer to ever live and honing the greatest chin ever seen. Living up to his nickname the Raging Bull, LaMotta fought so many of the greatest fighters of all time in the most brutal era in absolutely devastating wars. His resume is completely stacked with all-time greats and Hall of Famers. LaMotta was the only man to defeat the great Sugar Ray Robinson in his first 120 plus fights, eventually having a 6-fight saga against the greatest of all time. He would also defeat one of the greatest middleweights history's forgotten in Marcel Cerdan to become the middleweight champion of the world. LaMotta also scored 3 separate wins against the legendary welterweight champion Fritzy Zivic, a man so rough and rugged that Civic himself scored 2 back-to-back victories against the prime Henry Armstrong. LaMotta even knocked out the legendary heavyweight puncher Bob Satterfield, as well as scoring victories against Hall of Famers in Lou Jenkins and Holman Williams, one of the extremely avoided members of the Murderers Row, a fighter who would have been a world champion in any of the modern eras. There are also many wins and brutal sagas against some of the top contenders of the time, and despite history labelling LaMotta as a tough slugger, he was actually very crafty and made a lot of shots miss with his defence. After a brutally hard life and being involved in over 100 bloody wars in the sport's toughest era, LaMotta would live to the age of 95. Aaron Pryor was a complete whirlwind. As electrifying as a fighter that's ever existed, he was pure non-stop energy. This style saw him defeat genuine all-time greats in some of the most entertaining and action-packed fights in history. The standout victory of his career was that legendary fight against the all-time great Alexis Arguello, in which Pryor secured a late stoppage and ultimately stopped Arguello in the rematch. Besides his 2 Arguello wins, he also scored a legendary victory over the all-time great light welterweight champion Antonio Cervantes. There were also wins against world champions in Alfonso Fraser, the man who had defeated the legendary Nicolino Loche, and South Korean light welterweight champion Kim Sang-hyun. Being a prevalent star in the 1980s, Pryor was primed around the same time that the 4 Kings were in their peak. And whilst he didn't get those super fights against Duran, Leonard and Hearns, he still beat all of the all-time greats he stepped into the ring with, as well as winning 11 world title fights. He would lose just once in his career, and it's hard to recall someone that fought with such intensity at a high level. Bob Foster's 6-year run as light heavyweight champion was one of the best the division's ever seen. Winning the title in the late 60s by knocking out the legendary Dick Tiger, Foster brutally dominated the light heavyweight scene with an iron left hook that wiped out so many great fighters. Throughout his reign as light heavyweight champion, he retained the titles 14 different times. His one-punch power is the stuff of legend and has seen him ranked amongst the hardest punchers in the sport's history. He beat many of the champions and top contenders of his era and made some ill-fated moves up to heavyweight, losing to the likes of Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, Ernie Terrell, Zora Foley and Doug Jones, who are all much bigger. Due to his late inclusion at number 44, Spinx, Basilio and Ortiz are all moving a place up. Carmen Basilio has a strong case for being the toughest boxer to ever exist. Think of Basilio as a 1950s Arturo Gatti-esque fighter, but having those Gatti Ward kind of fights against the greatest fighters to ever live. Amazingly, Basilio was in the Fight of the Year winner on 5 separate occasions. But what makes this brutal fact even crazier is those 5 fights happened 5 years in a row. 2 of which were against none other than Sugar Ray Robinson, another against fellow middleweight great Jeeves Former, an absolutely brutal comeback against Tony DeMarco, and another brutal fight against Johnny Saxton. But it wasn't just Basilio's toughness that ranks him so highly, he was the welterweight and middleweight champion of the world. He won the title against middleweight world champion Sugar Ray Robinson in one of 2 brutal fights. And these feats at middleweight plus his fights against Former are even more impressive when you consider how small he was compared to the middleweights. Basilio beat an array of world champions and Hall of Famers at welterweight. He scored 4 knockout victories, 2 each against Johnny Saxton and Tony DeMarco, both welterweight champions, overcoming one of the worst beatings I've ever seen to defeat DeMarco. Basilio also beat legendary Hall of Famer Billy Graham, as well as one of the all-time great lightweight world champions in Ike Williams. He would also lose a split decision to perhaps Cuban's greatest ever professional boxer in Kid Gavilan, dropping the Cuban, who would never be stopped himself, in 143 fights. Of all of the legendary American boxers history has forgotten, Mike Spinx may be the biggest case. For over a 7-year span across the 1980s, Spinx embarked on one of the greatest light heavyweight runs the division's ever seen, becoming the undisputed light heavyweight champion, winning 2 unification fights in doing so, and defeating multiple Hall of Famers and genuine great champions in Dwight Muhammad Qawi, Eddie Mustafa Muhammad, Yaqui Lopez, Murray Sutherland, Marvin Johnson, and Eddie Davis in the process, making 10 successful defences of the light heavyweight crowns. And whilst this run alone, coming off the back of an Olympic gold medal, is enough to make him a national hero, Spinx piled on an extra 25 pounds to take on the much bigger heavyweights. And although he was outsized, he still KO'd Jerry Cooney and incredibly ended Larry Holmes' 12-year and 48-0 undefeated streak, whilst Holmes was actively defending his title and over 20 consecutive title wins in, considered one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. After ending Larry's legendary streak to win the lineal heavyweight title, he also defeated Holmes again in a rematch. And whilst many people tend to link Spinx solely to his crushing defeat to a prime Mike Tyson, it's important to remember his legendary 7+ year run, fighting world level opposition across a 50-pound weight difference. Californian-born Manuel Ortiz is one of the greatest fighters of the 1940s. A veteran of over 100 fights, Ortiz, who always faced stiff competition, amazingly made his debut against a future world title challenger. And between 1942 and 1950, he was the bantamweight champion of the world, losing it just once and reclaiming it just months later. Throughout his impeccable 8-year stint as bantamweight champion, Ortiz won a staggering 21 world title fights. Ortiz was strong, crafty, and opted to fight up close, compiling over 50 knockouts in his 100 career wins. Through his career, Ortiz would box many world champions ranging from flyweight to lightweight, including the legendary Willie Pep, as well as scoring victories over flyweight champions Jackie Patterson and Salvador Marino, multiple victories against bantamweight world champions Lou Salica and Harold Dade, as well as a victory over lightweight world champion Laros Alas. The weight span of world champions that Ortiz defeated ranges across the equivalent of 7 divisions today. Adding to that the reign and amount of wins he scored as bantamweight champion, he truly was a legendary fighter. The Michigan assassin Stanley Ketchel is widely believed to be one of the hardest punching pound-for-pound fighters in history. Ketchel's impact in the sport has left such a huge impact on some of the most illustrious boxing writers in history. The founder of the Ring magazine, Nat Fleischer, had Ketchel as his best middleweight of all time, past some of the all-time great fighters that would follow. And whilst I personally don't rate Ketchel quite as highly, his impact on the sport at such a young age is undeniable. Unfortunately, being over 110 years old, there's very little footage of Ketchel, but we can see him decking the all-time great heavyweight Jack Johnson before being knocked out himself with the next punch. And despite fighting such a huge opponent, Ketchel was actually the world middleweight champion and the first man to be a 2-time middleweight world champion. Ketchel defeated Hall of Fame middleweight champion Billy Papke 3 times, as well as 3 of the middleweight world champions before. He would stop the great light heavyweight Hall of Famer Philadelphia Jack O'Brien once, knocking him down 3 times in the other win, as well as even knocking out heavyweight contenders and knocking down Jack Johnson, as well as having a competitive fight against Sam Langford, who's an undeniable top 5 all-time great. And similar to that of Salvador Sanchez, Ketchel made such an impact before an early death, where he was murdered, being shot to death at just the age of 24. Ketchel had knocked out the great middleweights and light heavyweight Hall of Famers of his time, as well as facing 2 top 10 all-time greats. He was a wild man and an extremely aggressive fighter, scoring 46 knockouts in 51 wins. For someone that's practically unheard of, Harry Wills has a case for being one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. And while the likes of early heavyweight champions like Jack Dempsey and Jack Johnson are universally known, Harry Wills actually may have been the most talented heavyweight of that time era, and probably still holds the greatest resume. Due to the colour line at the time, Wills was never able to box for the heavyweight championship of the world, although the fight with Dempsey was once signed. Before Dempsey's promoter pulled the fight, and in stepped Toney, who would ultimately defeat Jack Dempsey to become champion. Unable to get a shot at the world heavyweight title, Harry Wills won the coloured heavyweight championship and defended it a staggering 26 times. Many of the black fighters of the early 20th century were extremely avoided and never given a real title shot. Nevertheless, they're legitimate Hall of Famers and some of the greatest of all time. Wills would score an unbelievable 12 victories against the all-time great Sam Langford, to just 2 defeats. There were multiple victories against Hall of Fame heavyweights in Sam McVeigh and Joe Jeanette, as well as the likes of battling Jim Johnson, the huge Fred Fulton and Jack Dempsey rival Luis Firpo. In total, the great Harry Wills had over 30 fights against International Boxing Hall of Famers. Sonny Liston may well be the most imposing heavyweight champion in history, and he's widely regarded as the most intimidating fighter ever. Liston's run to becoming heavyweight world champion might be one of the most impressive runs in the sport's history. He's the only man in the division's history to beat every top 10 contender on his way to the title. And the manner in which he was destroying all of the contenders in the one belt era was absolutely devastating. This included 2 knockout wins against the very dangerous Cleveland Williams, all within the first 3 rounds, whilst the run also included knockout wins over notable names such as Zora Foley, Willie Besmanoff, Nino Valdez and many others. After absolutely destroying the contenders, he eventually got his shot at the champion Patterson and knocked him out in the first round. To further prove he was the force at heavyweight, he gave Patterson an immediate rematch and once again completely steamrolled him in the first round. Liston in this run was one of the most formidable fighters the sport's ever seen. He was a complete wrecking ball with one of the most devastating jabs in history and was undeniably one of the strongest men to ever step into the ring. Sadly, his short reign, due to 2 defeats to a young Muhammad Ali, have somewhat overshadowed what an absolute beast Sonny Liston was. Billy Conn is widely recognised for his fights at heavyweight, especially his 2 fights against the legendary Joe Louis, in which most of this clip is made of. Despite being outsized by the great heavyweight champion, Conn was on the verge of beating Louis, and then in his iconic run as heavyweight champion, after 12 rounds in which he built a solid lead, completely staggering the heavyweight legend in round 12 before ultimately being worn down in the 13th. But despite these defeats to Louis, Conn was at his best at light heavyweight, where he was recognised as the world champion, beating many of the all-time greats in the division, as well as great middleweights and heavyweight champions. Conn scored victory against all-time great Hall of Famers Toney, as well as multiple victories against light heavyweight Hall of Famer Gus Lesnovich, Teddy Yaros, Jon Corbett III, and further world champions in Fred Apostoli, Teddy Yaros, Melio Patina, the all-time great welterweight world champion Fritzy Zivic, and even EBU heavyweight world champion Lee Savold. Considering these names are Hall of Famers ranging from welterweight to heavyweight, it compiles into one of the all-time brilliant resumes. And had he have held off Joe Louis for another 3 rounds, he would have pulled off one of the greatest victories in the sport's history on top of that. Despite his low knockout ratio, Conn used to fight much bigger men and throw beautiful combination punches. Tommy Loughran had one of the best boxing brains of the 1920s and the 1930s, considered to have the greatest jab of the era, a sensational ability to judge distance, and some of the greatest footwork of the early days of boxing. Loughran was able to beat many of boxing's all-time greatest fighters and Hall of Famers, ranging from welterweight up to heavyweight. Loughran himself would become the light heavyweight champion of the world, and his resume stands out amongst the very best. He fought the legendary Harry Greb 6 times, although losing 4 of those bouts, winning 1, and early on lost to the all-time great Gene Tunney. But as he developed into a complete fighter, he would start to defeat the likes of Mickey Walker, Mike McTeague, George Carpentier and Jeff Smith, all Hall of Famers from welterweight up to light heavyweight. But on top of this, he also defeated 3 heavyweight champions of the world in the great Max Baer, James J. Braddock and Jack Sharkey, as well as going the full 15 rounds with the heavyweight champion Primo Carnera. Despite being 80 pounds lighter, James Lights Out Toney is one of those rare modern day fighters that beat world champions all the way from middleweight up to heavyweight. An absolutely sensational all-time great American fighter who on his day beat some of the greatest fighters in the world in absolute masterclass performances. Toney's style was a perfectly entertaining mix of excellent defensive skills up close and blistering fast hands. He was never stopped in his career despite jumping up a huge amount of weight and very rarely dropped. His run at middleweight, beating the likes of Michael Nunn and Mike McCallum, was absolutely exceptional, and his victory against Iron Barkley is a punch-perfect performance. Toney had gone undefeated across his first 46 fights as a 2-division champion until he met the great Roy Jones Jr. But even after his run at these weights, his fights against Evander Holyfield, Vasily Zhirov and John Ruiz cemented his legacy even further as a great. Of all of boxing's best defensive fighters, I think James Toney was the best up close, outfighting someone and still not getting hit. He would go on to have 90 career fights, which in the modern era is absolutely staggering. The great Ike Williams' reign as lightweight champion of the world still remains one of the longest in the division's history, more than 70 years after it came to its finish. His 6 years and 1 month as champion is just 6 months shy of the great Roberto Duran's reign. Before he'd even turned 22 years old, Williams was a 74-fight veteran and the lightweight champion of the world. He had gone unbeaten across a 34-fight streak in which he made his name, already defeating a string of Hall of Famers in this time. From 1945 to 1951, Williams was the NBA, NYSAC and Ring Magazine lightweight champion of the world. Across his time as champion, he would score a trio of victories against the all-time great Bo Jack, would KO Hall of Famer Bob Montgomery, would defeat Hall of Famer Sammy Angot twice, the man who gave Willie Pep his only defeat in his first 130 fights, whilst also beating world champions in Juan Zarita, light welterweight champion Tippy Larkin, whilst also scoring multiple victories over welterweight world champion Johnny Bratton, and also defeating the great Cuban welterweight champion Kid Gavilan in the trilogy. Williams would also face off with the welterweight and middleweight champion Carmen Basilio. He was tall for the division but knew how to fight up close. He had excellent balance, amazing head movement, and threw blistering combinations with a speed and snap reminiscent of the great Sugar Ray Robinson. Jack Dempsey's impact on sports, let alone boxing on its own, is astronomical. The leading force of the Roaring Twenties, Dempsey revitalised boxing, being must-see entertainment and absolutely smashing the $1 million gate. Before winning the heavyweight title, Dempsey was homeless, travelling the country on trains, knocking out troublemakers to earn money. Once he obliterated the heavyweight champion Jess Willard, he completely transformed the sport. His menacing persona and furious style were the reason that sports were broadcast live on radio. He drew in one of the largest boxing attendances in history and ruled the heavyweight division as lineal champion for 7 years. Dempsey's title win against Willard is the most furious display in boxing history, knocking the champion down 7 times in the first round alone, breaking his cheekbone, multiple ribs and knocking out multiple teeth in the process. During his reign as champion, he knocked out Hall of Famers in Jack Sharkey, Louis Firpo, Tommy Gibbons, George Carpentier, as long as many other challengers. And on his way to the title, he beat many Hall of Famers in the process. His era was one of the toughest, and he almost single-handedly brought boxing to the forefront of American sports, with brutal violence and many underrated skills, such as the Dempsey shift, which many were copying the century to follow. Having stepped in with all the greats of his era, Oscar De La Hoya has a strong case for honing the greatest resume in modern boxing history. There's never been another fighter that's taken on the current pound-for-pound #1 as many times as Oscar has, and alongside his incredible resume, his achievements are off the charts and nearly unmatched. Behind Pacquiao, boxing's only official 8-division champion, Oscar won titles in 6 divisions, being the second person in history to do so. De La Hoya accumulated close to 30 world title fights in his career, where he would defeat the likes of Pernell Whitaker, Hector Camacho, Julio Cesar Chavez, Arturo Gatti, Jorge Paez, John Molina and many others. Taking into account the fact he had close fights with Trinidad and Shane Mosley, as well as facing a prime Pacquiao and Mayweather, moving up to middleweight to face Bernard Hopkins, he was one of boxing's most fearless warriors and one of its most popular fighters too. Smoking Joe Frazier was as relentless as any other heavyweight in history. Honing the greatest left hook the division's ever seen, Frazier severely punished some of heavyweight boxing's greatest ever fighters. Across the late 60s to the early 70s, the heavyweight champion of the world Frazier was awarded the Fighter of the Year award on 4 different occasions. His trilogy with Muhammad Ali is widely regarded as the greatest in the sport's history. During his peak years, he scored many great victories as champion, with his first against Ali being the standout. Frazier defeated top names in Joe Bugner, Jimmy Ellis, Bob Foster, Jerry Quarry, Oscar Bonavena, George Savallo, Buster Mathis Jr., amongst many others. The 4 defeats in his career came solely to the 2 greatest heavyweights of his era in Muhammad Ali and George Foreman. His relentless aggression and devastating hooks to body and head were perfectly coincided with one of the greatest bob and weave defences on the front foot. Amazingly, Gene Toney lost just 1 fight in his 85-fight career to a man many deem the greatest of all time in Harry Greb. And whilst Toney is famously known as the heavyweight world champion after defeating Jack Dempsey twice to end his long reign, the fighting Marine had already embarked on a phenomenal career at light heavyweight prior. Although he lost severely to Greb in their first fight, he returned the favour, scoring 3 victories in return and a draw. He would also defeat Hall of Famers at light heavyweight in George Carpentier, Tommy Loughran, who features on this list, battling Levinsky, Jeff Smith, Leo Hawke and Tommy Gibbons. When you take into account his move to heavyweight, defeating the great Jack Dempsey simultaneously, albeit being given an extra 5 seconds to climb off the canvas against Dempsey in their long count fight, when in the heat of the moment, the Manasseh Mauler had forgotten the new rule to head to the neutral corner after a knockdown. Toney truly had one of the all-time great careers in every sense. Unfortunately at the time, he wasn't really appreciated for it. For a fighter of the time period, he was miles ahead of his time, using his brains, IQ and skills to outbox opposition. Unfortunately in the 20s, Jack Dempsey's violent style had won the hearts of the nation. So Toney's more intellectual, elegant style went unappreciated.